Well, last week we're in our long series on Mark and the Gospels, and in this series last week, Clint talked about the whole idea of offense and choosing not to be offended. And it's tough when we get, things bother us, they make us angry, we get frustrated in life. And, I think at times we even think that our anger is justified. It's righteous indignation, right? At least mine most of the time is, in my mind. Reality is, though, not so much. A lot of my anger is just that. It's just me. And especially when I think about it later and think, oh, I wish I hadn't have said that, or why did I do that, or why did I respond that way? I was really proud of myself this morning because a guy cut me off in traffic coming to church. And I just went, that was all I did. No fingers were raised, no words came out. I just went, and then I prayed for him. So, little victories. But sometimes anger is justified. Sometimes anger brings about change. This past week in Sri Lanka, the people rose up and said they didn't like the way things were going, so they charged the presidential palace, and the president resigned. Now, only time will tell if that was a good decision for the country. But there are things that sometimes anger and frustration and pain cause us to make decisions that are good, change laws, like laws we have now for vehicle safety. We have to be strapped in, and we don't have metal dashboards anymore to plant our face into. And remember, they used to have those visors. Some were even made of metal, and they hung down right about there, so, if you're in an accident. And all that's kind of changed. We have laws now to reduce the amount of pollutants that go into our water and air, and those things are good as well. And so sometimes anger is justified. And we looked 2 weeks ago at how Jesus was certainly frustrated and disappointed and somewhat angry with the disciples when he says, why is it that you're so faithless? Why is it, or how long am I going to put up with you? I mean, those were strong words. Jesus had some righteous anger at times, because he was frustrated with the systems, especially the religious systems. That's why he called the religious leaders, he said, you empty graves, you whitewashed tombs, you brood of snakes. Those aren't compliments. And sometimes when we think of Jesus, and if I said to you, what qualities of Jesus stand out to you, you would think of his grace and mercy and compassion and kindness and empathy and love toward people. But there was another side of Jesus that contended for holiness and to live a life submitted to God. And as Jesus is getting closer to Jerusalem and his last week with his disciples before he's going to be arrested and beaten and crucified and then rise from the dead, he knows he has to get across to them the importance of this idea, of what it means to really be devoted to God. And so we're going to look today in Mark chapter 11, two incidents that occur that seem unrelated, but actually they're connected. And the first is Jesus cursing the fig tree, and then him overturning the tables in the courtyard area. We're going to pick it up here in Mark chapter 11 and verse 11. It says, Jesus entered Jerusalem, and he went to the temple, and he looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Now, Jesus has come to the temple. This is the fourth feast of the year. It's the Feast of Passover, the biggest one. He walks into town, and it's late in the day, so he looks around at everything, and then they go out to Bethany, where he's probably staying with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And he just surveys everything. Now, you have to understand what was going on at the time, a little bit about the temple and the feast. This was the highest, holiest time of the year on the Jewish calendar. They believed that at this time, probably about 50,000 people lived in Jerusalem. It wasn't a big city. But at this time of year, 100 to 200,000 extra people, Jews would come from all over the world back to Jerusalem for this feast. I mean, that's a lot of people to add. And so this was an 8-day festival that culminated through a week long of repentance and sacrifice, and the last day was the high day of Passover, where the priest would take the blood of the token lamb and go into the Holy of Holies and the inner court there, and he would lay the blood on the altar or on the Ark of the Covenant. Now, let me show you a little bit about the temple, because everything was built around the temple at this point. Let's put up this next slide here. If you'll see the outer court, see that big area there? That's like 10 football fields. It's huge. And that was called the court of the Gentiles. Not because they were the most honored, but that put them the farthest away from the really good spots. You know, this is like the bleachers way out there. Then you had the court of women up at the top. And if you go to the next slide, see a little closer, you have the altar, and then the area where the men could go outside in that red box. The men could go there, but inside the temple, where all the slats are there, that was the inner court, and that was just for priests. And then one time a year, where that red box is, that was the Holy of Holies. One time a year, the high priest could go in there to offer the sacrifice for Passover. So this was how the temple was laid out. You had the Gentiles, the furthest, and then the women, and then the men, and then the priests, and then one high priest who got to go into God's presence once a year. Now, this was a crazy time. Think about 200,000 people coming into town extra. Imagine Indianapolis if 4 million people showed up and all needed accommodations. And by the way, Josephus, the Jewish historian, says that during this Passover week, this 8 days, 255,000 sheep were sacrificed. Think about that. I was doing the math. That's 36,000 a day. Or if you worked in 12-hour shifts, that's 3,000 per hour. It's a lot of lamb. You know, that's a lot of sacrifice, a lot of blood, a lot of activity. And most of these people, when they came for the feast, they may come a long distance. Some traveled 1,000 miles to get there. When they got there, they wouldn't have brought a lamb with them or a dove if you were poor. So you would buy it there. And so to set up a place where all this could be bought and sold, if you go back one slide again, guess where it happened? In the court of the Gentiles. And that'll all play into what we're going to look at here in just a moment. But first, as Jesus comes into town, remember it's late at night, he kind of looks at all this happening, and then they go out to Bethany. So the next morning they get up and they're heading back to Jerusalem to be part of the Passover. And it says, as they were leaving, verse 12, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in a distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. And when he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for fruit or for figs. Then he said to the tree, so Jesus is speaking to a tree, he says, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And all the disciples heard it. I don't know about you, but just to be honest, this verse has always kind of bothered me a little bit. How about you? Do you have an issue with the fact that Jesus is cursing a tree and it's not even the season for figs? I mean, what happened? Was Jesus just really hangry that day, you know? I mean, he got up and, you know, I mean, you've been there maybe, especially if you're dieting or something, you know, just like mad at the world because you can't eat what you want to. You know, I don't think that was Jesus. I don't think that was him. Now, Bertrand Russell, the famous atheist of the 20th century, he said this. He said, what Jesus displayed was vindictive fury to an innocent plant, manifesting behavior is not conducive with a righteous man, let alone the Son of God. He marked this as one of the reasons he did not believe in Christianity. He quotes this passage. He goes, right there, I can't follow Jesus because of that. Joseph Klausner wrote in his book, he said this was a gross injustice on a tree which was guilty of no wrong. Think about what environmentalists would do today. Now, let me help you with this part first, okay? I did some research, and actually in the Middle East, when figs would first leaf in the spring, there's also these little nodules that would come out, about that big, and they were soft, and they were called pigim. And these pigim would grow. You see a little one there on the left. That's not the figs on the right, but you see that little thing and then the leaf above it. And those are called pigim. And you could eat those. They weren't sweet like figs, but they were something you could eat. So as a traveler is going down the road, and it's like a convenience store, you stop in, get some of those, handful of those, and those would kind of satisfy your hunger until you ate a larger meal. And so what Jesus was looking for was not full figs, because it wasn't the season for that, but what he was expecting to be on this tree was more than just leaves. He was expecting there to be some fruit. And these little pigim are fruit, just early fruit that the plant puts out. Now, Jesus is giving an object lesson, kind of a live illustration, to show God's perspective and coming judgment on Jerusalem and the people of Israel. Because these people claim to be devoted to God, they claim to be following God, but yet there was no fruit coming off their life. We might call them hypocrites. And Jesus was direct in calling them that. See, he cursed the tree, and he wanted the disciples to see this, because even though it looked healthy on the outside, even though the outward appearance was it looks good, and it looks normal, and it looks healthy, there was no fruit being born. It was a hypocritical fig tree. In all living things, growth happens. And then every living thing that grows reproduces and bears fruit. When it doesn't, if a child stops growing, that's an issue. There's something unhealthy or not right in them. And so we have to treat that and help them. See, the leaves gave off an appearance that was fake. I think when I read this week, I just kept asking myself, and my prayer over and over again was, God, how much of my life is just leaves? And how much is really fruit being born out of my life? What am I producing for your kingdom? In John 15, Jesus had a lot to say about this. I want to put up 3 verses from John 15 that kind of summarize this whole chapter. Jesus said, "Yes, I am the vine and you're the branches. Those who remain in me and I in them will produce much fruit." Not just fruit, but much fruit. "For apart from me, you can do nothing. When you produce much fruit, you're my true disciples. That brings great glory to the Father. You didn't choose me, I chose you and appointed you to go and produce lasting fruit, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask for using my name." This is Jesus' expectation of his followers. Not just fruit, but much fruit. Lasting fruit. Fruit that remains. This is a call to build our life around, not ourselves, and just putting out token leaves so we look okay to God and to others. God looks under those leaves. He looks at the heart and says, "What's really going on inside of you?" "Oh God, I'm fine." He goes, "You're not fine because you're not producing fruit." That's how God talked to me. He says, "That's what I want to see. That's what I want to help you with. That's your purpose." And we get so far away. We get so much into building our own lives, and we just strive after more money, more success, more stuff, while all the time claiming that's not what's really important. But yet, if you look at how somebody spends their time and money, that's where most of it goes. To just building a life for themselves, producing leaves. See, when the pilgrims would have entered the temple, walking into Jerusalem, their first reaction might have been, "Wow, look at the temple. I mean, the temple took years to build. At this point, around AD 30, when Jesus came to the temple, it still had another 25 years of construction before it was done. And it was right about the time it got done that the Romans came in and destroyed it. But they would have walked in and went, look at this place. Wow, this is modern. This has every convenience. I mean, gosh, they've got the best worshipers here and the best sacrificial system and the best kids program. Look at this. They even got little kid take-home sacrifice kits so they can practice. I mean, everything was included. This was the pinnacle, the place to be. This was the hottest church going on. And yet, what nobody knew, go back to that slide on the temple, the second one. Making these guys jump around. Yeah, that next one down there. What they didn't realize is that red box, the Holy of Holies, there was no Ark of the Covenant in there. It was gone. Nobody knew where it was. It had probably been stolen or destroyed by the Babylonians. So I hate to wreck your Indiana Jones, scenario, but and I know the Ethiopians say they have it, but you can't see it. I love that. We have it. Can we see it? No. We only get to see it. No, it's not hidden somewhere. It's not buried under Jerusalem or anything like that. It probably just doesn't exist. And here, everything around the feast, everything was about a priest getting to one time a year go in and sprinkle blood on the Ark of the Covenant, which represented the very presence of God in the world. If you wanted to meet with God, that was the place to do it. And if you weren't a high priest, then there were degrees further back from the access to the presence of God. This is why when Jesus died, the first thing that happened was the temple curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from everything else was ripped open from top to bottom. Imagine that. Surprise! It's empty. And it was this empty religion and all the activity done in the name of God that everybody felt good about. They felt good about showing up at church. They felt good about giving a little bit. But their lives weren't centered around God. This was just religious activity to make them feel better. More leaves. More leaves. See, in cursing the fig tree, Jesus is preparing the disciples with a little teaching moment privately for what he's about to do publicly. Look at verse 15. The next day, on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling. He overturned the tables. One gospel says he made this whip and started going through and just knocking everything over. The tables, the money changers, and the benches of those selling doves who would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. This place is holy, and Jesus is trying to reestablish that. My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. And he began to look for a way to, and the chief priests and teachers of law heard this and began to look for a way to kill him, but they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed at his teachings. Let's go back to that slide of the temple. The first one there. Let's see. Yeah, the bigger one. That's it. All this was happening in the court of the Gentiles. Now, this is how corrupt the whole system was. If you were poor and you couldn't offer a lamb to sacrifice, the good news is God would accept a pigeon. But unfortunately, the price of pigeons during Passover went up by 16 times. So a pigeon a family might be able to afford for $10 now costs $160. I think the price of gas is bad. That kind of markup. We call that price gouging. Today there are laws to prevent that from happening. But not here. It was just part of the religious cartel that was taking advantage of people. Oh, you can't use your Roman money to offer God. First, you have to exchange it into holy money, Jewish money. And we'll do that for a fee. So the people were paying to buy Jewish money so they could buy overpriced animals to sacrifice to God. How much do you think that made them really love God and go, yay, let's go worship? And if you were a Gentile that was exploring faith, you were a seeker and you're wanting to discover, is this real? Maybe I want to give my life to this, and you haven't gone all the way yet because that big step there, it's not like raise a hand, pray a prayer. There it was be circumcised. So I'd be serious about it at that point. And so the Gentiles who hadn't made that step yet, this was their place. This was their place, even though it wasn't within the temple. And it wasn't even close to God. It was at least their place that they could seek God. And the Jewish religious leaders said, we don't care about them. Drive them out. We'll set up the whole market here and make lots of money. You see why Jesus might be a little upset? The people that are supposed to be representing God and leading the people to follow God are so corrupt that they're completely missing God's intent of what the feasts were all about. Now, church history, unfortunately, has a lot of chapters with this kind of corruption. Martin Luther wrote a letter, an open letter to Pope Leo in 1520, and he says this: the Roman Church, once the holiest of all, has become the most licentious den of thieves, the most shameless of all brothels, the kingdom of sin and death and hell. It is so bad that even if Antichrist himself, if he should come, could think of nothing to add to its wickedness. And I'm surprised he didn't cuss. Martin Luther cussed a lot. He was a man, though, that followed the religious system, that strove to do everything right, to keep the rules. And he realized, while he was crawling up the steps to St. Peter's Basilica, that nothing he could do could change his heart and make him right with God. He might feel good for a little bit. He went to church, felt good for a little bit, and then he was gone. And it just didn't work in his life. But when he had that transformative encounter with God, where he surrendered his life completely to God and said, God, I'm yours, Jesus came to dwell in him. And he was saved not by his works, but by grace. And because of that, grace was working into his life and was so substantial and such an important part of his life, he built his life around that grace, not only experiencing it, but sharing it with others. So when he sees the church that's supposed to be distributing the grace of God and the message of hope to the world, what he sees is exactly the opposite. Manipulating people through fear to control them and so on, to dangle hell above their heads all the time. And that if they didn't give, and if they didn't just perform exactly what the church wanted, they would be on the outs with God. Jesus hates religion. Because at its best, what religion does, it becomes an idol and it tells us that we're fine. Religion specializes in leaf producing. As long as you've got leaves, man, you're okay. And then we begin to create a God and shape him in our image, who's fine with that. And that's what happens with a lot of church people. Oh, I'm fine. I'm good. Really? Because when I lift up these leaves, there's no fruit there. Don't look there. We just leaves. If God's going to dwell in us, and we're to be the temple of God, our primary pursuit in life cannot be just a more comfortable life. This is why Jesus was so harsh with the religious leaders. I get concerned when I hear Christians just consumed with the news and all the bad news, and that's all they talk about. I'm thinking, guys, it's just leaves. It's just leaves. And a lot of them look kind of burnt and disappointed and shriveling up. See, Jesus was really concerned about some issues like equality and justice. When Jesus went through and was overturning the temple, or the tables and everything, he had to be thinking, because he quotes from Isaiah 56. It says this, God says, I will also bless the foreigners who commit themselves to the Lord, who serve him and love him, who worship him and do not desecrate the Sabbath day of rest, and who hold fast my covenant. I will bring them to my holy mountain of Jerusalem, the temple, and I will fill them with joy in my house of prayer. I will accept their burnt offerings and sacrifices, because my temple will be called a house of prayer for all nations. The ground is level at the cross. See, it was commonly believed among the Jews at this point that when Messiah came, he would purge the temple of Gentiles. Jesus came and purged the temple for the Gentiles. They were believing the exact opposite. How do things get so twisted like that? That we can move away from grace and kindness and mercy and love and sacrifice to just focus on self-preservation and making my own life better. Jesus was very strong, and these stories are recorded to let us know that we don't want to be on the wrong side of this. And at times we can. We can justify things and want to move in a direction that seems right for us or right for our family or what's good for me. Instead of going, yeah, I'll take the hit. I'll make the sacrifice, because that's more honoring to Jesus. One of the things that always struck me, because I always tried to figure out, why did the early church grow so rapidly? Just they outgave, they outloved their community. Whenever a Roman, for example, in the city of Rome, whenever there was a Roman person who was sick, or a child that was deformed or something, and the Roman people just throw them out in the street, the church would go and get them. If they died, they would go dig the grave and bury them. In this kind of radical love, they would take their food and give it away to where they had no food left. They weren't building bunkers. They weren't preppers. And they were facing far more persecution than we are. Okay? What they did was they gave away all their food, because they said, those people have no faith. They can't believe God for food. We can. So we're going to give away everything as a means to love them and then watch God do miracles for us. Different, isn't it? And we wonder at times why the church in America doesn't have the same impact and why we're losing young people. Because young people will get a hold of a radical message like that and say, that's something I can live for. That's radical. I can do that. That's something I can give my life to. But if they just see leaves, they go, that doesn't look very good. As I close, here are some discipleship questions that I want us to sit in for just a few moments. First one, how do you measure fruitfulness in your life? And how may it differ from God's idea of fruitfulness? Are there some tables that Jesus is wanting to turn over in our lives? What does I mean by that? Are there idols or things that we're trusting in? Our resources, our abilities, our job, our employer, our 401k, our ability to take care of ourselves. Are there any of those things we're trusting in? Nothing wrong with having them. It's just where our trust is. How loosely we hold it. Wealth is a wonderful thing when it's used for God's kingdom. And then the last question there. What might be a big win for God through you this week? I mean, we think of what would fruit look like? So here's what I want us to do. I just want us to still ourselves for a moment, not rush into communion and activity, because I don't want it to be just religious activity today. I want us to take a moment and just say, Father, show me, lift up the leaves, and let me see my heart the way you see it. Now again, God never does this in anger. If we come humbly, He always shows incredible mercy and kindness and a desire to help us. That's the heart of God. The only time God is harsh is with religious people that there's no other way to get through, and they're so deceived, He's got to open their eyes. But I believe your heart is open to God this morning. And I believe it's tender before Him. And I think you want to bear fruit in your life and live a life pleasing to God. Not that you're going to hell if you don't, but that you can enjoy the abundant life that Jesus described in John 10:10.